Hi, this is Chris Shattuck with buildamodule.com, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the Form API. So the Drupal Form API, for those who are unfamiliar, stands for Advanced Programming Interface, and it basically exposes a set of functionality to Drupal developers that allows them to create forms, to do some really hard things with forms, but very easily. So if you've had any experience building forms just with straight PHP or HTML, you've probably found that it's easy to do. It's easy to create a form. I mean, it's just a bunch of HTML tags. But as you build a form, there are implications as you start to develop and evolve the form. Like, am I making this secure? How do I validate all of the information before it goes into the database? How do I process after I've gotten all of the information? If there are other aspects of the site that need to plug into that form, how do I expose those? So Drupal has the Form API basically boils down a form into its basic elements, and all a form is an array of values that set the different inputs. So it looks a little foreign at first, especially if you're not familiar with arrays, because arrays are the way that the Form API works. But through the Form API, you get a lot. So the first thing it does is create a form from an array. So you just apply an array with just the base elements, and then you can then theme the form using a form theme function. So this is a good separation of code versus presentation. So as far as those who are familiar with what a model view controller framework is all about, this sort of falls into that category. It allows developers to create a form and themers and designers to actually wrap that form and make it look the way it needs to without influencing any of the validation or functionality or processing that goes along with the form. So that can be very handy. The Form API allows you to validate a form before the information gets processed, and then allows you to process the information once it's passed validation with submit functions. And finally, by using the Form API instead of a vanilla form, PHP or HTML form, you allow other modules to plug into the form and change it with the hook form alter. With a hook form alter, the entire form array is passed to any modules who define this hook, and it allows them to do whatever they want with it. So they can hide elements, add new elements, change the way certain elements are displayed. So it allows your module to be a jumping off point for other modules, which can be really cool. So as you're trying to learn the Form API, it's really hard to find good, simple examples, either in core modules or contributed modules. And that's because Drupal has done an awesome job of making all of the simple forms even simpler. So we went over, in a previous video, we went over the settings form, the administrative settings form for a module. That's really easy to make, but that would be one candidate for where you would see a simple form example. The node form, any time you're working with content, all of those forms are already built into Drupal. So when people end up having to create forms, they're for usually advanced purposes, and we'll go over a few examples in Contrib to kind of illustrate some different variations there. Let me show you a few resources before we go into the examples. So the first resource I want to point you to is the Forms API reference page. Now this is as you work on forms and develop forms and start to have more questions, this page is going to be your Bible. I go to this page almost every time I have to create a form. While it doesn't give you the step-by-step instructions, what it does is tell you what attributes are available for what inputs, and gives you lots of examples. So there's tons of information here. And so your browser search functionality is going to come in real handy as you want to jump around, because scanning this is just doesn't work so well. If you do want the quick start, here's how do you build a simple form. There's another good page on api.drupal.org called the Forms API Quick Start Guide, and this will take you through step by step just how to create a real simple form, how it's structured, how to theme it, how to validate and submit the form. So this is probably a really simple example, but it's not necessarily a working one. I mean, you can get it working, but you can't see. Looking at Contrib is kind of nice because you can see how those forms are being displayed right away. Also, I should have mentioned this resource in earlier videos, but the Pro Drupal Development Book is a really awesome resource for learning all of this stuff. It gives you, if you like reading books, it'll give you some good tips and good references to to a lot of this stuff that I cover on this site. Not all of it, but for instance, the Forms API, there's a whole section on that. And if you get the PDF version, then it's easily searchable and you can copy and paste and use that. Also, if you're curious about the model view controller framework thingy that I mentioned a little earlier, just search on Google for Drupal MVC and you can see what people talk about around that idea. Okay, so let's take a look at some code. First, I want to look at at a contributed module called Voting API. And the Voting API is a cool little module that doesn't really do much visibly, but it provides a background resource for other modules like 5-star, several up-down dig type modules to track votes, to limit number of votes per user, things like that. And it just so happens that they have one of the simplest forms I could find for generating some dummy votes, so that if you want to kind of see instead of clicking a bunch of votes to populate your voting database, you can instead generate it. And this is associated with the Devel module. So the Devel module allows you to generate different types of content, and this plugs into that in order to provide this generate votes functionality. So as you can see, we're in the hook menu, and there is a item here that says if this module exists, so if the Devel generate module exists, then go ahead and add this page. And just like we went over the module settings form in a previous video, and that used the Drupal get form as a page callback as well. And so that's one way to generate a form on a page. If a form is going to be the only thing on a page, then this is one less step you have to do. So instead of creating a function to generate a page, you can instead call this, and it generates a page and renders the form at the same time. And so that's one less step for you. And then it's being passed a string that's the name of the form that's going to be generated. So that gets passed to the Drupal get form function. And so what we want to look at in order to see how the form is constructed is this function. And as you can see, there's a file defined for this menu item. So we're going to hop over to this file and take a look at the function. Okay, here's the function. And I'm just going to scroll down so you can see how long this is. Not too long, just a little longer than a single page here. Let's go ahead and walk this through step by step. So it starts out by generating an array of node types by using the node getTypes function. This is a real handy function. If you've got a note taker, take this one down because you'll want it at some point. Then it loops through each one and creates an array of key value pairs, an associative array, which it's putting into the options variable. And this options variable is then passed down here, as you can see, to a form item. So if you watched the module settings form video, you'll know that how these form elements are structured. Basically, the key for the array is the name of the input, and then the array is a set of key value pairs that set a bunch of parameters for the form element. So in this case, the type corresponds to a type of input. So in this case, it's checkboxes, but there's also radio buttons, text inputs, text areas, and the options that are being passed to it is an array of items that are going to be passed to the checkboxes. So this is one, if you've ever tried creating this on your own, you can already see that there's a bunch of time being saved here because we're generating a list of checkboxes that are by just passing it an array of options. So that's pretty cool. We have a title, which just helps the user understand what the node type is. The default value is being passed in an array of the keys for the options. So thus, it makes all of the options checked by default. So next, the next input is a select type, and the format is very similar to the checkboxes or the radios. It gets passed a list of key value pairs in the options. So as you can see, the options here, we have a few 5, flag, up, down for the different types of modules that there are. And then we have, or the different types of voting. And then we have the default value, which looks like it might be a carryover from a previous version of the module since there's no % option here. The next input is a checkbox, just a simple checkbox, and you can see there's this type, title, and default value. It's unchecked by default. And then finally there's a submit button. So when you do create a form, you need a submit button in order for someone to submit it. And then it returns a form. So it doesn't, this definition of a form doesn't actually render at all. All it is a definition of an array. So you could easily create this array anywhere and then pass it to the Drupal get form function. So this function doesn't have a validation function. It just goes ahead and assumes that the input is going to be valid, and then it submits it. And to create a submit function automatically, as you can see, we didn't define any submit function in the form, although that is an option. But to do it by default, the Drupal will look for the form name, the function name, plus an underscore and submit. And then it will be passed two variables, the form, which is the form array, and then the form state, which contains a list, an array of items that have been submitted. So the values of each input will be stored in that form state, as well as some other information. So what this one does when you submit it is it runs the voting API generate votes function. So that sounds pretty clear. Once it's submitted, it generates the votes. This is a pretty straightforward form. Let's go ahead and take a look at another example that's a little bit more, probably a little bit more difficult to read, but still pretty simple. This one comes from the teleport module. And the teleport module is a pretty groovy little module that allows you to jump to any page by typing in a few keystrokes, and then it creates this autocomplete list, and you can choose an option from there to automatically jump to the page. So this is as opposed to navigating through your site via the default navigation system on the side. And I just wanted to show you real quick how this form was created. In the voting API module, the form was created in a menu item. In this version, we're embedding the form inside of another page. So what's being done is in this function called teleport results page, the output being generated adds the teleport form to it. And so this way you can see how if you have something that's a little more complex or you want to embed the form somewhere, this is how you'd go about it. Let's take a look at the form real quick. We'll look at it line by line, although some of the lines don't really impact us much. They're not ones we're necessarily that interested in. So first, the form is defined as an array. Again, it's good to define your variables. An action is defined, which is when this form is submitted, what URL do we want it to go to? And then a field set is defined in which the module can add additional fields. So the next module takes it, or the next form input takes advantage of that by, you can see, it adds the input inside of an array, inside of the array element defined for that field set. So form teleport and then label. This sort of nested array thing is quite common in functions. It might be difficult to look at at first, but it's about as simple as it can get. So this label is just a real simple, some real simple HTML. This is one of the inputs that allows you to just add some HTML. And then we have another input, which is a text field. And there's some additional parameters here that are interesting. One is autocomplete path. So the Drupal Forms API, one other cool thing that it does is it has by default a set of autocomplete tools. And you can use the default autocomplete, or you can actually create your a variation on it, which this module has done. So when somebody starts typing in this input, what it's going to do is start calling this page, which is actually more of a callback rather than a page. And that page will generate a list of possible matches for that path. So this is a really difficult thing to do when you're just doing it from scratch. So the fact that Drupal supplies this is really awesome, and it takes a little bit of getting used to, but the learning curve there is so small in comparison to trying to get that functionality on your own. So really good idea here. And the default value is using some session stored variables, it looks like, to make sure that if somebody has already pre-typed something, that it doesn't go away as the page reloads. So finally, there's a submit function, and then there's a close button. It looks like it's adding some additional HTML there to the form. And then finally, if the user has access, as the comment says, it adds a little bit more HTML that generates a link to the teleport settings module. Okay, so this one, there are a few more steps here. When the module is submitted, it runs the teleport form submit. As you can see, it follows the same structure as the voting API module did, in that it just takes the form name and adds _submit to it. Again, the form variable and the form state variables are being passed. And so this one will do a few different things, it looks like, once it's submitted. But the important part here to recognize is that there is this a very simple system. So creating a form is really quite easy. And if you're looking for examples, a lot of the details you can skip over when you're looking at contributed modules or core modules for examples of how the form API is used. So let's take a look at one more example that's just a little different. It approaches things a little differently. This is the user core module. And we're going to start by just looking at the form itself instead of where it's added. The user login form is added. There's a block for it, as well as a page. So both of them use these same functions and embed this form in different ways. So So with this one has a couple points that I just want to draw your attention to. So first of all, what it's doing here is if the user already exists, then it's sending it back to the page. It doesn't want you to, if you go to /user on Drupal, on a Drupal site, and you're already logged in, it'll take you to your page, and this is the code that's doing that. Then it's adding a text area input for your username. It's adding some description, and then a password as well, a password input. And then these are the interesting parts here, the validate variable or parameter to the form. And this is taking a function here, but if we scroll down just a little bit and see what this function is, it's pretty straightforward. The function just returns an array, which is a set of function names that will be run during the validation part of the form. So it looks like instead of one big validation function, they've split it up into several little ones, probably to be more manageable, to be able to tackle different parts of it as more people work on the project. So you can imagine this line as being the hashtag validate is that array. One other thing I should point out is that this hashtag here, you see that before any parameter that is an attribute of the array. So that's just a common way to identify a parameter to the array, or to the form, or whatever it is that's being built, and it also prevents naming conflicts if you're adding your own key value pairs to the arrays. And then finally, we've got the submit function, which is a pretty simple, and then we have the submit input. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of these validation functions real quick and see what's going on. So if we scroll down a little further, we can see here's the first validation function. And then there's a second validation function, a third validation function, and then there's a function called user authenticate, and then there's no submit function. So what's happening here is that somewhere along the lines, there's something in the process that will affect whether the validation functions will continue to process, and there's some part of the validation that will then decide what to do next. So there's no need for a submit function. So this is I'm showing this as an illustration of way that the form API can kind of be twisted around a little bit, even in core, to provide some unique sort of workflows. So you don't necessarily have to stick to this validation submit flow if it doesn't make sense, but almost every time it will. So if we look at the validation functions, we'll see that there's some validation being done here to determine if the user is blocked or if the IP has been blocked, and then it authenticates the user. So that's the user authenticate function, and that function actually loads up the user, and if the user is good to go, then it will go ahead and process it, continue to process it, and eventually it will get passed. You'll get passed back to your user homepage. So, if you've ever wondered what's going on behind the scenes during this process, this is it. And it's using, this user module is core, one of the core modules of Drupal. Like you can't imagine Drupal without it, right? So it's using the form API just as well as any contributed module that you would develop. So I just wanted to, use a few examples here. Let me show you real quick how a couple of these forms display. So let's go back to the voting API one. And so this has just a few inputs. let's take a quick look at what that looks like. So here's the form that gets generated when you go to that URL. So you can see the URL up here. And then the teleport module, let's go ahead and hop back to the form there, has just a couple inputs, and the teleport module form is triggered by a keystroke, so I'm pressing Control N, and that will load up the teleport page. And I mentioned the autocomplete, so as you're typing, it will create a list of potential places that you might want to go to. So you just hit enter, enter again, and it will launch you to that page. Pretty handy. So these examples illustrate that the form API can can be used to really narrow down what it normally creates to generate a form into a very small bits of code. It's boiled down as much as possible, and there's a lot of power there with the validation functions and the submit functions. One of the things I didn't mention is that if you have a set of options for, say, a checkboxes, or a submit, or a select input, and you have a finite set of options there, the validation function by default will check to make sure that what's being submitted is actually a real option. So that prevents users from, using Firefox and changing those values before it's actually submitted. So there's actually a lot of security stuff going on behind the scenes, even if you don't create a validation function or a submit function. So it pays off to stick within this format. As you develop as a developer, as a Drupal developer, you'll start to learn more about what those behind the scenes things are. So that's it for this video. It was a bit of a longer one. I hope you enjoyed it, and hope we clarified some of the benefits of using the Form API. Thanks a lot. Good luck and happy coding.